I'm Phil Rickaby, and I've been a writer and performer for almost 30 years. But I've realized that I don't really know as much as I should about the theatre scene outside of my particular Toronto bubble. Now, I'm on a quest to learn as much as I can about the theatre scene across Canada. So join me as I talk with mainstream theatre creators you may have heard of and indie artists you really should know, as we find out just what it takes to be Stageworthy. If you value the work that I do on Stageworthy, please consider leaving a donation either as a one-time thing or on a recurring monthly basis. Stageworthy is created entirely by me, and I give it to you free of charge with no advertising or other sponsored messages. Your continuing support helps me to cover the cost of producing and distributing the show. Just 4 people donating $5 a month would help me cover the cost of podcast hosting alone. Help me continue to bring you this podcast. You can find a link to donate in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast app or at the website at stageworthy.ca. Now, on to the show. Francis Proulx is a Canadian theatre maker and puppeteer originally from Northern Ontario and now based in Toronto. He is touring 2 shows to the Canadian Fringe circuit this summer, his adult show, The Family Crow, a murder mystery, and his family-friendly musical, Emilio's A Million Chameleons. Here's our conversation. Francis Proulx, thank you so much for joining me. You have a couple of shows that are touring Fringe festivals this summer. I know you've got one for kids and one not so much for kids. You've got or not at all for kids. Is Family Crow at all for kids, or is it?
I mean, it's funny because when people see puppets, they think it's for kids. So I get the question a lot. Can I bring my kid? And I'm maybe I wouldn't be the best parent, but I always have the same answer. It's like, I don't know your kids. You're welcome to bring them. I mean, I don't know what that question means, right? Like, none of the crows are gay, if that's what you're worried about. But it is about a quintuple homicide, so You do you.
Yeah. I remember Gillian English used to I've seen her react to somebody in a crowd with a kid and be like, I know you brought a child, and I want to make sure that you're sure about that. And the person will be like, I'm sure about it. And 5 minutes into the show, they're like, whoop, out they go, because it's not for kids. So you're doing the Family Crow, and you're taking that to a few cities, right?
Yes, first in Toronto, and then Winnipeg, and then Edmonton. And between Winnipeg and Edmonton, we're actually at the Puppets Up Festival in Almont, Ontario. And those are fun. All... fun. Those are all the Family Crow gigs this summer, and then we are doing a big old October tour. It's a murder mystery, right? The Family Crow, a murder mystery, so it's well suited to sort of spooky Halloween season. So that'll take up our October. And
I think, is it Vancouver or Victoria is getting your children friendly show, A Million Chameleons?
Yes, Vancouver Fringe is getting Emilio's A Million Chameleons.
Nice. And that is a say that 5 times fast sort of thing, which I'm sure that you've done by now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and anybody who's seen the show, as soon as you say it, this theme song that I wrote with Chris Sugiuchi, it's an earworm. We did a big northern tour, and I get emails from people who saw it up there, or the presenters or whatever, just saying it's still stuck in my head.
Well, how is that for you as the person who really has to hear it every night?
Yeah, I mean, like, at a certain, having done theme park shows, you're 800 shows in, it all sounds ludicrous. So I think I'm desensitized to it.
It's true. But it is funny what it sort of plays in your head. I've been front of house in theater for a number of musicals, and you get to a point with those where the show is just constantly running in your head, and you could turn to anybody else who's like front of house and be like, where are you in this show right now? And they could tell you what song they're on.
Oh man, I think I'd hate that. I mean, there was this great. I don't remember if it was This American Life or one of the other many podcasts that did something about the closing of Phantom. But one of the
Right.
musicians who'd been with the show from the beginning, but she'd never seen the show in all those years, and then she went out and watched it, and I mean that sounds. First of all, doing the show for that many decades sounds horrible, but then to see it and finally go, "Oh, that's what they're doing."
Yeah,
That
yeah.
far in, that sounds wild to me.
Well, I mean, if you're really focused on your job, then you don't need to see the show. But also, kind of weird to not be curious for like what 30, 20 years or however long this show ran.
Yeah, wasn't it like 30? Yeah, it was 35 years.
Something wild like that.
Yeah, sounds like torture.
um. So with a show like let's talk about the Family Crow, which is a triple homicide, a fun-filled triple homicide romp with puppets. Tell me about that show. What's the fringe pitch for the Family Crow?
Yeah, puppets, puns, and murder. That's what I say. It's so the idea is you got one. It's a one puppet show actually, and the puppet for the bulk of the show sits atop my top hat, and it is the narrator. It's the detective there to solve the murder that has happened within the Family Crow, and then I, as the sort of like bird stand, play all the other characters. I play the children, the mother, the father, and so he sort of sits up on top of my head and then looks down at me. So the conceit is sort of that he's puppeting me, right? Which is sort of flipped on its head from what you usually see in a sort of, I mean, not that there's a ton of puppet murder mysteries, but like usually the style would be that the puppeteer is the detective or the narrator, and then all the characters are being manipulated. I want
Right.
to flip that. So the puppet is the narrator, and I am, I'm sort of his puppet, if that makes sense.
What was you've been doing this show for a little while. You did a run at in the fall at the Red Sand Castle.
Yeah.
But you've been doing this show for a little while. What was the genesis of this show? What was it that was behind the creation of the Family Crow?
It was so I was at Winter Mini Fest in Orlando in 2017, no, 2018, so January 2018. And so this was with my old show Baker's Dozen, 12 Angry Puppets, and so I was doing that show in Orlando, and then my next gig was more Baker's Dozen shows in St. John's, and there was like 2 weeks in between, and I had the choice of going early to St. John's or staying in Florida in the middle of January. So the choice was clear as far as I'm concerned. So I stayed in Florida after my shows, and then just, I kind of had nothing to do other than wait and enjoy, the moderate sunshine. And so I had this idea about a murder mystery, right? Because the joke of the show is that a group of crows is called a murder, so it's a murder mystery.
Right.
And so, like, kind of, it began with the play on words, and it began with the title, and I just sort of sat down and wrote this thing for fun, completely for fun. I didn't think a show with one puppet would be enough to compel an audience for an hour plus. So I wrote it for fun, and then I left it. I went and I went about my life and did other work, and then I came back to it, like a year later, and I read it and I was like, that's quite funny. And it doesn't even say, I don't know if you've ever written anything and you read it back later and you're like, that doesn't even sound like me. That's not my same two jokes I always use. That's like different jokes. And so I did that, and then I started, working on the puppet, and then I was meant to do it in summer 2020. Obviously, that didn't happen, so it kind of sat on the shelf for a while. And then last year, Orlando, Montreal, Vancouver, and then that run in Red Sand Castle, and up north where I'm from, Sault Ste. Marie, we did some shows up there for the Algoma Fall Festival as well.
There is something about a constraint, like to constrain yourself to one puppet, and you're forced to find solutions and creative ways around that constraint. As starting out by thinking like that just one puppet, that's ridiculous. But what was the surprise for you as you were writing, as you were performing it, like just through the process? What surprised you most of all?
The thing that so two things. Like, as I worked on it with Byron LaViolette, who's the director of Morrow and Jasp and Pearl Harbor Chautauqua, and I mean, he had the same questions I did, right? And one of the things we do in the show is I run all the lights with my feet. Like there's foot pedals and desk lamps. So that's all the lighting. So we're doing that. And we got the puppet, and I tried really hard to think about how to spread out the puppet's tricks, of which there are not many, right? So it sits on my top hat for a long time. And then like halfway through the show, maybe a little less, maybe a third through the show, it comes off my top hat for the first time. And then because you're being careful with spreading out what it does and what it can do, when it comes off my top hat, the audience goes, "Oh," which is funny because I just took it off my top hat, right? And the surprise was, doing that, and then later its wings flap and its mouth moves for the whole time, and then but really it doesn't do that much. It does what it has to. You don't, in my opinion, you don't want to build a lot of mechs or tricks into a puppet on stage, because then they break, right? And then your show sucks. And so spreading out what it can do over an hour, what was surprising is how much the audience, they really, not only did they appreciate that, but when I talk to people after the show, they think the puppet does more than it does, right? Their imagination fills in like all the different articulations it has, and it simply doesn't, right? Like that, it's just sort of diligent doling out of its abilities. And the other big surprise, which isn't really it's moderately puppet related, but nobody recognizes me after the show. I do not wear makeup. I do not obscure my face. They look at me for an hour, and I had a full conversation with a woman after Orlando Fringe. I was holding an award with my name on it. Yeah. I was wearing a shirt with a crow on it. I was wearing a button with a crow on it. I had my name tag on that said my show title. And she came up to me and she's talking, and she said, "So what's your show called?" And I said, "Oh, it's called The Family Crow." And she said, "Oh, I saw it twice. I just loved it." Great.
No, but I love people. It's like the kids who go to Sesame Street and they only see the puppets. They don't see the friend, even though this person's mouth is moving and all that sort of stuff. It's amazing the things that people don't notice. You were describing like the way that audiences think the puppet does more than it does. I'm reminded of. Do you know the Wonder Heads?
Oh yeah, love the Wonder Heads.
Yeah, the Wonder Head. The full head mask. Not puppets, but full head mask.
Yeah.
But when you see a show, you swear that the face changes, that something changes in it. But it doesn't. It's a static mask. So very similar in that the magic of the theatrical moment is people filling in the blanks of what the mask or the puppet is doing.
Yeah, and that's a testament to their talent as performers and their building, right? The sculpt on those heads is incredible.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, it's that, like, I often use the phrase like lo-fi charm when I'm talking about building and about aesthetic, because, like, to me, it's more exciting when the audience has to fill things in with imagination. Like, There's nothing worse than a puppet where, there's a blink mechanism built in, but, a blink mechanism in a puppet is usually like your middle finger is like pulling down. And so you get like this blink motion as it's talking, and it's like, just skip it.
You don't need to blink. Blink is an extra thing that it doesn't need.
No. And sometimes, I don't know, like a blink mechanism can be great. Like, the design of this puppet, or at least the sort of like the vague mechanism of it, is based on the Zazu puppet from Lion King, and that puppet does have a blink mechanism, which allows it to look surprised and angry, and that's great. I do not have a puppet team on my shows, and I do not have multiple puppets, and so like that for me is a bridge too far. It's a phrase I use a lot in rehearsals and in developing a show is it's a long walk for a ham sandwich. Like, yes, I could make it blink, but is it going to be that much better? Probably not, right?
Yeah, there's something about, the audience filling in the blanks in something is actually ultimately more rewarding to the audience than to have everything done for them. Huge budget of special effects and things like that. That's all well and good, but the visceral feeling they leave with when they've done a lot of the work is far more valuable.
100%. And it's the thing that theater can do, and arguably puppetry can do, better than Netflix is going to do for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the things you see doing really well in fringe festivals, especially right now, are those things that people can't watch at home. The things that, like Wonderheads, like puppetry, magic, things that are interactive, James and Jamesy's stuff. I listened to your interview with them the other day. It's like, those are the things that are doing well because you can't really replicate that on screen.
Well, they're experiences, right?
Yeah.
And that's what people kind of want. That's what gets people out of their house, away from Netflix and Prime and Apple TV and Crave and all of the services that you could possibly have. They need something to be like, well, so I could stay home and watch something, but what about this thing that sounds interesting? And they need that now. We can't just guy on a stage. There has to be something.
I think that's correct, and I wonder how long that'll stay that way. But that's definitely what I'm perceiving. Like last year at one of the fringes that can remain nameless, that a lot of the artists were like, "Oh, I'm not selling, and it's not going well." And I was at that particular fringe, I sold out my entire run. Like there wasn't a seat to be had, and so I was kind of like sheepishly like, "Oh dear, what am I doing? Like, is my show that much better? I don't think so. Is my marketing that much better? No, we all use the same graphic designer, for God's sake." Like I don't think I don't think it's that different, but it is weird, and it is, there's enough, like, sort of, I hesitate to use the word audience interaction because it's not, but like enough relationship with the audience that it is just different, right? It is an experience versus going to a theater museum and watching a thing.
Yeah. There is something about the fact that people have spent the last 3 years or whatever not leaving their house and being very comfortable at home, watching all of the things on TV through the streaming services and whatnot. And people are still, I think, although people say, I want to get out of my house, I think that generally in the evening, when a lot of theater takes place, people are not as excited to leave their house unless there's something to draw them out.
100%. Even so, with our Red Sandcastle run, it's fun when you self-produce. You get stats. I have a business degree. I like numbers and spreadsheets and crap like that. And we had a 15%. That's 15% no-show rate. I mean, that's always going to happen to a degree, but these are people who separated with their money. They parted from their money. Yeah. They bought the ticket, they made the plan, and then they didn't come. And I mean, that's okay. We get to put other people in the seats, and that's great. But like, no refunds. But it's like, wow, like those are the people who really wanted to come, right? And I do think everyone's having to work harder now. If those people aren't showing up, like, try getting the people who are maybe hesitant to go or not convinced that they're going to go in the first place. Like it's a challenge, a unique challenge we're in right now, getting people to leave their couches.
Yeah, I really think it is. And I think I kind of feel like as far as when we advertise our shows, in a lot of cases, we don't do a great job. Like I look at some of the big theater companies in Toronto and beyond, and when they talk about this show, they talk about, the title of the show, who wrote it, who's in it, what's the show about, but not really what your experience is going to be. And if I'm trying to figure out, do I spend $20 or more to go see the show here, or I already paid for Netflix? Like, I know what I could see a trailer for that. I can't see a trailer for this. I don't know. People choose staying at home when we don't give them that. And I think that we have to, I really think theater needs to do better and change the way that they talk about shows.
There's got to be a difference between a grant application and a show advertisement copy, right?
Absolutely.
Like, I would even take what you said a step further and say that we have to put theater on our posters. Everything looks the same now. A movie poster looks like a theater poster, looks like a gum advertisement, right? If people who maybe don't go to the theater don't know what they're looking at when they walk by the telephone pole with your poster on it, unless you put, for the Red Sandcastle run, live theater this October, or spooky live theater this October or something, so people can go, oh, it's a play. Because how, it's obvious to us. It's certainly obvious to me. I'm putting on the play, but like, they see a weirdo with a puppet on his head, and what does that tell them? Not enough, right? Like, we need to tell them this is theater, and then you're quite right. Like, go beyond that. Like, what is your experience going to be? I get scolded sometimes because I'm not so big, depending on the city, about having my name on the poster, because who cares, right? Like, unless that means something. Like in Toronto or up in the Soo, maybe I'll do that. But like elsewhere, you know, they don't care. You have very limited space to tell them what's going on. They don't care it's me. They care what their experience is going to be. So like, I try to remove ego from that and say, is it useful? Is it going to tell people what this is? If not, get it off the poster, make it less cluttered.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's, you're right about that kind of thing, like telling people that it's theater and giving them a sense of what the show's going to be like. Eldritch Theater does a great job of that. They
I
always
agree.
have video of the show. They always, in addition to stuff from behind the scenes, but they always have video. You can see, get a sense of what the show might look like, what it might feel like. And I think that they have a lot of success with bringing in an audience, many of whom are not regular theater goers. So I think they do a great job of that.
800%. Yeah. And I mean, they are to be commended because they have a very defined aesthetic. Unlike, get myself in trouble, unlike most, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you ask me what an Eldritch Theater show looks like, I
Mhm.
could draw you a pretty good picture. If you ask me what a show at any of the institutional theaters in Toronto looks like, I couldn't draw you a very clear picture, and they would all look very similar, right?
Mm.
Like, and that's not to say everyone needs to do work that looks the same all the time, but Eldritch does a great job of looking like Eldritch.
They have a very an aesthetic that's theirs, and that doesn't work for every theater company. Some
No.
theater companies have a really broad mandate, but I think it's not just about what they do for each show could translate to an individual show at one of those larger theaters, rather than what I feel is advertising to people who are already going to see your show
Hmm.
or who are likely to see your show, rather than trying to broaden your horizon and bring in people who might be disposed to see your show but just don't know about it and just don't know that they might like it.
Yeah, 100%.
Why don't we talk about Emilio's a Million? I'm gonna stumble over that one because I haven't had the same
Come
kind of
on, let's
practice.
practice.
Emilio's a Million Chameleons. Tell me
There.
what is that show like, and what's it about aside from the show with the earworm of a theme song?
Yeah, it is. It is definitely that. So it came about via Tarragon Theatre, their greenhouse festival. So I was an artist in residence there for the greenhouse festival. I went to them, and my pitch was a paper thin pitch that said I wanted to make a show with that flip sequin fabric. You know, you swipe it and it changes colors. And I thought, I think that's a really interesting design tool that I've not seen used in theater at all, and I want to play with that. I mean, the people who were choosing included Justin Miller, aka Pearl Harbor, and Heather Caplap. I was talking about sequins, and they were a captive audience right out of the gate. And so, fortunately for me, they chose my application, and then I went, oh boy, now I have to do something. And really all I had was that limitation. Chameleons sort of came a little later, and then on one of the long drives back from the Soo, I said it'd be funny if it was called Emilian Chameleons. It'd be really funny if it was called Emilio's Emilian Chameleons, and like that was it. So the idea of the show is it's an old timey like vaudeville circus show. It's a chameleon cabaret. There's a million chameleons behind the set, this big inflatable set that we have, and there's a million chameleons back there. We roll these big dice in the audience, and that chooses what act comes next. So you got plate spinning, you got dancing, you got harmonica playing, like all these acts that the chameleons do. You learn through the course of the show that me, Emilio, I'm also the puppeteer of these chameleon puppets, of course. I am the son of Emilio Sr. He made this show world famous, and I'm doing my own kind of poor job of keeping it going. And at a certain point, the set deflates and it reveals that there aren't a million chameleons back there. It's just me and one of them, Juan. And it's me and Juan, and we're just a couple of hucksters doing our best and trying to be like Dad was. And then in the end, we kind of bolster each other and sing a moving duet, again, that I wrote with Chris Sugiuchi, that teaches us that it's good to be yourself and it's good to let your inner sparkle shine. And then there's a confetti cannon and the show's over. It's great.
I mean, if you can't end with a confetti cannon, I mean, you should always, if you can.
If you can, I mean, yeah, and like if you really want to not get along with your technician for the first hour of the day, I insist you say, "I'm showing up with a confetti cannon." We did shows at the McMichael Gallery, and we're in this gallery with priceless works of art from the Group of Seven, and we skipped the confetti cannon that day. Let me
I,
assure
I
you.
I understand. I understand skipping the confetti cannon that day. But I mean that's like two sides of a coin, right? If you're walking in and with if you're walking in with the family crow and you're controlling the lights and you're easy time for your house tech, and then
Absolutely.
to be like, oh yeah, in my other show I'm making up for the fact that in this show there's a confetti cannon.
And yeah, it's true that that show is considerably more tech heavy, especially because it's all tracks for the music.
Right.
But we did, knowing that we had that northern tour coming up, we did build it to be able to go. You just never know what you're going to walk into, right? In
Mm-hmm.
these tours. So we built it so if it's in a gym on the floor with nothing, it had to be able to work. And if it's in 1,000-seat theater with all the lights in the world, that has to work too. And we did both of those, and it did work. Obviously, I have a preference, but
There's something about the flexibility you need to do not just any tour but a fringe tour especially because every city that you go to you're going to be in a different space. Some might be a room in a library, some might be an actual theater. There's so many differences. um as somebody who's done the fringe circuit, um how hard was it for you to come to terms with the fact that you're gonna have these differences every time you go to a new city, and how hard was it for you to learn to accommodate for that?
you know, I it's interesting because I've kind of with all my shows I've kind of designed them with that in mind from the get-go, right? Like I've designed for the limitations, and I like that. Like you said, there's something about a limitation that's fun. Um and so of course you still end up in venues where you're like, oh God, not that limitation, right? Like there's still problems sometimes. Like so, Orlando is an example. Like I was quite concerned last year. I was in this venue. It's like a rehearsal hall at the Orlando Shakes, and they set up the audience so it's like I think like 30 seats on each side of you, and then like 20 seats in the middle. So it's mostly people sitting beside you. And I was like, I'm doing puppet theater. This is not going to work. Um, but then I got there and I set up the lights in a semicircle instead of in the straight line like I'd been rehearsing, and it turned into a ghost story, right? Like we're doing ghost stories, and that's how I do the show all the time now because it kind of made me go, it works better this way. It's
Hmm.
theater in the round. I mean, it's not, but that was kind of a thrust situation, and you're just like constantly moving. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, people won't be able to see you sometimes, but that's okay. Like I said, it's one puppet. Like keeping your cards close to your chest is okay in that circumstance.
Right.
So yeah, so I mean, limitations are a fun design challenge. I think one of the things I'm trying to deal with, like so for this. I've got sitting in my living room a 25-foot backdrop, 25 by 15-foot backdrop. That depending on the venue, if it's feasible, it's going to be hung this sort of drapey down kind of situation for the family crow because it's great when you're in these intimate fringe venues and you can have this show that's designed for the limitations therein. But then when you go to the 1,000-seat theaters, which is something that I'm planning for, it's like so. Can you still make that show big, right? Like, can that still fill the space, even though it's the same show?
Have you had the opportunity to try that out yet, or what's your feeling on that so far?
The backdrop just arrived, so we're gonna try it this summer, maybe at Factory. It really depends on like how easy it is to hang things in the fringe venue that's going to allow it.
Mm,
But certainly for the October tour, I mean, the thing is, to make an independent tour work, you kind of need to be touring to a certain amount of seats. So while we
right.
could find 70-seat venues, we're looking more so at like 300 to 500-seat venues,
Mm-hmm.
and in that case, they're big theaters, right?
Yeah.
They've got a lot of space to fill, and so yeah, we'll see. And I hope it doesn't take away from my hashtag lo-fi charm that I was talking about.
I'm sure it won't. It's just a backdrop.
It's just a backdrop. You get nervous though, you
Yeah,
know?
I know. I know. Whenever you add something, it's
Yeah.
like, is this too much? Is this a bridge too far?
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the show that you just worked on in Sault Ste. Marie, a fairy tale. Tell me about that show.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, and I was working on this other script a number of years ago that sort of related to the Canada-U.S. border. For those who don't know, Sault Ste. Marie sits on the Canada-U.S. border. The St. Mary's River runs between Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And so while I was researching this other script, my dad came across a news article that was a sort of remember when that was written by the librarians at the Sault Ste. Marie Public Library. And it was the story of a guy named John, who was American, and a woman named Mary, who was Canadian. And they met, they fell in love, they got married, they lived together for a while. And then for a couple of reasons, one day they just weren't allowed to be in each other's countries anymore. So they were stuck, Mary in Canada, John in the States. And they, nowadays, there's a bridge that runs between the two Saults. Until like 1964, 67, something like that, there was a ferry. So this took place in the 30s. They realized a workaround was that they could meet on the ferry. So they'd finish their work every night, and they'd go get on the ferry and just ride it back and forth, all night long until sort of last stops, and then they go their separate ways. So this is a true story. As soon as I read it, I was like, well, that's good for visual storytelling right there. That's just like prime. And so, I started applying for funding as we do, and I started doing research with lots of help from the public libraries on both sides of the border, the Chippewa County Historical Society, Sault Ste. Marie Museum. Also, I realized that a friend of mine, her grandfather was the captain of the ferry at that time and had all of his logbooks still with information from those dates, which is so cool. So I started doing the research. The funding came through, which I guess is not surprising. It's a very northern story, right? Like very Sault Ste. Marie specific, and I'm not sure how many sort of like historically accurate puppet theater show applications they have coming through the Ontario Arts Council on any given day. But it just it seemed to capture the attention, and so we did it in May. I've been sort of working on it for a number of years in terms of sort of writing and collaborating with artists and graphic designers. I didn't do much of the building myself this time because it was all two-dimensional, like sort of paper puppets. We had like a cooking show camera that was like from above, an overhead camera that looked down, and I used newspapers and documents and little animated puppets, characters, photos, things like that to tell the story in a 2D way. And my hands are fully visible, and so the audience got the experience of looking at me doing this, and then behind was projected the sort of movie that we were making, right? So we did our shows in the Sioux. We taped the bejesus out of it. We have like 8 angles or something, so it's going to be edited into a short. We're figuring out what to do with that short after. But it was really fun.
Now, as a relatively new show, there's always the question: you finish a show, it goes well, whatever. You sort of have to think now: does this have legs after this initial performance? What's your feeling about Fairy Tale? Does it have legs? Does it have a future on a tour?
I mean, the producer brain part of me is like, I fit this whole show into an artist portfolio, right? Like compared with Emilio's A Million Chameleons, which is like a confetti cannon leaking oil everywhere. It's just a nightmare. This show is like super small. And at first I wasn't sure if anybody would care about a Sault Ste. Marie story outside of the Sioux, but I do think there's a sort of universality of the story. It is just like a lovely sort of tragic love story. If I were to make it into like a touring fringe show, which I think it could be, it would probably be a mix of storytelling and the puppet show, right? Like split it into 3 acts and tell stories in between, just to give people who aren't from the Sioux the context. And there were lots of great border stories, right? Like I know a guy in the Sioux who during the pandemic, he was dating a woman from Sioux, Michigan, and he's from Sioux, Ontario, but they couldn't cross the border. So he drove to Toronto, flew to Detroit, took a bus to Sioux, Michigan, and then had to stay for 2 weeks because of COVID protocols, all to go like 100 feet. So like there's lots of these stories, and I think COVID has made it particularly relevant. This idea of borders. So I think that's part of why people reacted. Like the audience reaction was like outsized for what it was.
Mm.
I'm like, these are paper dollies. What's happening? But no, people were quite moved by it, I think.
Well, I mean, even as you're describing just the story to me, I find it already moving. So to have it portrayed in some way, I think you're right about the universality of it.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be curious to see sort of, so much of this is just like you're kind of throwing crap at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? And so I will. I'm certainly not saying no to any further life for this. I'm curious to see what the short looks like and what life that brings. But yeah, I'll be curious to see what attention it gets. And some shows get like lots of attention for development, right? Like
Mhm.
I have this one show I've been working on for years, and it gets like all the development attention, but like production attention, no, never heard of it.
It's funny the way things work out.
It is.
One of the things that I like to talk to people about, because I feel like everybody has their own story of their theater origin story, that thing that made them want to start doing theater, that thing that drew them to it, that keeps them going. For you, what's your story? What is your origin story in the theater?
So my dad is a drummer, and a very good drummer, and he would drum in pit bands in Sault Ste. Marie Community Theatre. They were doing a Vita, and my brother had just been born. He's about 3 years younger, and my mother said, "You have to do something with this other child." And so, my dad took me to rehearsal, and one of my earliest memories is sitting on his shoulders in the orchestra pit playing Evita, which, if you know Evita, that's no small feat to have a child on your shoulder. That's a lot of 7/8 time to have a toddler on your shoulders. And the music director was someone who grew to become my greatest mentor, Susan Barber, up in the Sioux, and that was one of my first memories. Then I became interested. So, they would take me to see things after that. My dad took me to see Joseph like 5 times, which is a lot in a community theater run of not many shows, right? It was just like every night, okay, we're going again. And yeah, and so the first thing I did was Fiddler on the Roof. I was 6 years old. I sang Dreidel, Dreidel, Dreidel for my audition. And that was directed by Susan Barber, who I mentioned. And then I kept going. There have been so many times in my life where I'm like, all right, I'll stop when I get to high school because I should focus on my grades. I'll stop when I get to university because I'm doing the business degree. I'll stop, after university. It just never happened. I just kept sort of drawing me back in. Now I really think of it like a calling, like the priesthood more than a career choice. It's like there's no getting out of it. This is what I know how to do. It is, not to be woo woo, but it is sort of the gift I have to give the world, and so here we are.
Now you mentioned studying business, and that's the second time you've mentioned having a business degree.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of times people who go into the theater, they don't think of the business aspect, and they certainly haven't studied the business aspect. Did you go to theater school, or did you just keep doing theater while you studied business? And how has that affected, or how is that reflected in your theater practice?
I mean, it's everything. It's called show business, kids. I did 2 degrees. University of Waterloo, where I went, has a theater program, and it's liberal arts. It's not a conservatory program, but they have an honors arts and business program. So what that looks like is you do your arts and business program, and then you choose a second major. So that could be economics, which falls under arts, which is what most normal people do. I chose theater. I was one of 2 people who did the sort of theater, arts, and business hybrid. I'm very used to being the hippie in the business room, and I'm very used to being the really conservative business one in the hippie room, in the artist room. And I think most people who work with me would agree that it is one of my greatest strengths that I'm able to straddle both of those fields. And I think a lot of artists think that it's not very artful to think of the business. And I couldn't disagree more. Of course, there are ways that business can kill art. Like, don't get me wrong, but we need people to see it. If a tree falls in the woods, kind of thing, right? You need people to come and see it. And honestly, I don't think I would have gone as far down the puppetry path as I have if it hadn't been for the business part of me. That was like, well, how many brown-haired actors can there be in Toronto, right? Like, I needed something that could go in a poster that would put me 10% ahead of everybody else. And honestly, the idea of flyering just me was mortifying. But I was like, I could flyer with a puppet, no problem. So I started writing puppet theater, and that's sort of how it all started. And it is alarming, how little attention is given in training programs and theater school, and how, not just that, but like how resistant people are to thinking about business and theater. I sometimes teach for TJ Dawn, Megan Phillips' solo show course that they do. I teach branding, I think, or marketing or something like that. And it's just a little chat. And it's always, TJ always has to preface with like, now, it's not a dirty word to say branding with your show. Like, and that's so it's so counter to how I think about things. But whenever he does that, I'm like, oh yeah, like, that this is really weird for artists to think about. This is not something everybody does.
Well, when I was in theater school, we did a business of acting course, which really talked about like, how do you get auditions? How do you keep your career going, and how do you, do your taxes?
Yeah.
Things like that. But nobody ever talked about like theater as a bit. Like, we weren't even talking about the creation of theater when I was in theater school. It was just something you didn't do.
Yeah.
Which I wish that we'd talked about it then, because all of us have ended up creating our own theater in some way or another. But also, when you see people who understand, say for example, branding and how to advertise a show, how to create a show. Gillian English, for example, is brilliant at it.
Yep.
And I learned so much from her, just looking at her posters, talking to her about how she like chooses a show, and also like all of her like merch that she has. And she said if she doesn't know how to pitch a show, how to advertise a show, she doesn't even write it. Like, that's where she starts from. And it's
I love that so much.
It's so important. And it's funny because being somebody who's a member of the media, around Fringe time, like, I will start getting an influx of inquiries and press releases 2 weeks before the Toronto Fringe Festival, which is far too late. I'm a weekly podcast. I can only do like one episode a week, but it happens every year. And people don't think enough about that aspect. It's one of the last things that people think. But yourself, with that business background, how do you approach, say, a Fringe tour or a Fringe show from a business aspect first, before you even get to the production?
Yeah, I mean, there, to take it as far back as I can, like you said about Jillian, it's like, can I sell this show? That is an important consideration, and then you produce, and there are different reasons to do Fringe. If you just want to go up on stage and spend some audience time, that's totally okay, right? Like, you don't have to do it to make a ton of money, but it doesn't hurt to break even so you could do it again sometime, right? So thinking about, like, do I know how to sell this show? And then, as you're going, one of the most useful tools is, if you do test shows or in your early performances, or even if someone's reading your script for you or something, just saying, what's the show about? Tell me how you would describe this to your Aunt Mildred. And that's where I got puppets, puns, and murder, because someone said it's about puppets and puns and murder and stuff, and I was like, great, that's the program copy, because It's so immediately clear, and it's casual, which I can get away with the the company and show that I have, but it's so clear. And so often I see Fringe copy where you read it and you kind of read it 3 times and you're like, I think that's word salad, I don't even know what that means, right? And
yeah.
And yeah, so thinking about that, how you're going to describe it, and then as you go, keeping that in mind every step of the way. And like you said, like it's 2 weeks before is far too late. Like you need your photos, you need your graphic design. It's really hard with a first festival with a show, because you don't have all that stuff. And so that's, part of the journey why I encourage people to not just be like, I'm doing one festival ever with my show. It's like that's your development festival kind of, right?
Yeah. I think I do think that it's the Toronto Fringe tends to be people who do the Fringe locally, and a lot of people don't tour. But you learn so much. Like if you're just creating a show for Toronto, you can do that. You can say this is a show that Toronto will love. But again, like you couldn't take that show to Montreal or Winnipeg or Edmonton and expect it to do the same. You need to learn so much about you'll learn so much about your show itself just by taking it to different places. And I think people not thinking about how they're going to pitch the show, even the pitch, like you see people on the first day of the Fringe Festival and they're like, I don't know what my pitch is yet. And you're like, you really need to work on that. Like,
yeah,
so many times.
Absolutely. And that's why I say ask other people, because it is hard to describe your show. You're like, well, there's this happens and that happens. But like, yeah, you're when you're doing a drive-by pitch, it really needs to be concise. And you're right about what you say, but you can't. Toronto's unique that way. Toronto Fringe, I think there are a lot of people who just do local shows, and it's funny because I think a lot of the touring artists don't get as much attention here as they do in the other festivals.
No.
Which is funny because often touring artists are the ones who do it for a living, and their shows are like have a level of polish that is to be excited about. But yeah, and then I see sometimes Toronto artists who've just like blown the roof off the place in Toronto, and then they show up at another festival and they're like, well, why is no one coming? And it's like, well, because your cousins aren't here. Like you have to you have to market, right? Facebook posting alone is not marketing enough when you're in a new city. And it makes you think about like how people accept the information you're giving them and all that stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. It's like I've spoken to artists who are Fringe artists, but they don't do Toronto. And they don't do Toronto because they've been told by other artists who tour that Toronto's not friendly to out of town artists. And it's other that's what the Fringe wants, but the media doesn't give a lot of attention, and audience, and as a result, audiences don't give a lot of attention. So you'll have a really amazing show that just doesn't get seen, and so why bother? And that's to the city's detriment, because they're missing out on a lot of great shows because of that.
Absolutely. And it's honestly, so I love the Toronto Fringe. I have a very good relationship with them. I'm doing it this year, and they've been very helpful a number of times with like the recommender grants for theater creators through Ontario Arts Council. So and Lucy and the whole gang there, lovely people. My opinion was not very positive of Toronto Fringe. It was my first festival that I ever did, and it was a new show. Like I said, development festival. I will never open a show in Toronto again. Let me tell you, I will go to Poughkeepsie before I open a show in Toronto. I didn't have a great time, right? and the show was new, and it was my first show. And it wasn't until, what was my first festival after that? Montreal, where I went to Montreal and I kind of like did, I'm sure, a better version of the show, but like marginally, right? And then I like started selling out and winning awards and stuff. And then Vancouver happened, and the same thing happened. Then Orlando happened, and it just went through the roof. And it was like, wait, so in my own city, people don't care, and yet I leave, and all of a sudden people care. And that has changed for me through the years with Toronto, but it is a different beast. I understand why people are hesitant to try and crack it.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, like loving the Fringe. It's theater Christmas for me. It's like I love the Toronto Fringe. I spend so much time talking to Fringe artists. I love promoting it. But again, it's not a festival that is friendly for failure. It's not an experimenting. It's not like I'm going to try this out. Toronto audiences and Toronto media want it polished, and they want it perfect. And so if it's a new show that you've never tried out before, and you might be a little iffy about it, and it's sort of experimental, it's not the place for it. And you
go to Montreal.
Montreal is great for it. A place like Montreal, they're like, sure, bring us your mess. And by
Yeah.
the time you leave, it's less of a mess because you've had the time to fix it and clean it. Sex T-Rex will often do that. They'll start in Montreal and they learn from each performance and they fix and they do this thing. By the time they leave, they have a polished show. But Montreal is so friendly to it and loves the it gives you the space to fail without punishing you for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very funny working with Byron, who's the director of Morrow and Jasp, and when we talk about Toronto Fringe or just fringes in general, it's like, yeah, I really hate having empty seats, says Adam, and Byron is kind of like, yeah, I don't know what that's like. Like, Morrow and Jasp, they're just golden children. So whenever it's like, yeah, but what if I get a bad review? And he's like, I can't speak to that. And it's like, oh, screw off.
Right. Right. But I mean, even with that, like you can have this show that sells out in say Montreal, and you can have the show that sells out in Winnipeg, but Calgary hates it. Like
Oh yeah,
you don't know. And suddenly you're like, why did I do well in Winnipeg and Calgary? I can't get people to come and see my show. It's like every place is different, and every place is so strange and weird.
strange and weird, and like, yeah, I mean, I've never had more different experiences at back-to-back festivals like I did going from Orlando, where COVID was over on like March 23rd, 2020, and then to Montreal, where I'm doing this like very punny English show, and like, a lot of the audience is French as a first language there, and like it's a very English show, right? Like it's wordplay and it's like a lot of obscure words, and so people were listening, so Orlando was raucous, and Montreal, people were paying attention, and they seemed to like it. Reviews were good, ticket sales were good, but it's like, is this what it sounds like when you like it here? Oh, okay.
Well, it's funny because I toured a show that was a play in the style of silent film, and when you're not talking and you only have like a piano that's like making the sound, it was amazing to watch an audience like think that they couldn't make noise, they
Yeah.
couldn't laugh, and sometimes we would finish the show and nobody really laughed, but you could look at it and you could see they were smiling, and then they would applaud like they had a good time. But if you had a good laugher, then suddenly everybody was like, oh yes, we can laugh. But again, when they're listening, when they're paying attention, things like that, sometimes the laughs just don't come, and I could definitely see that in Montreal.
Yeah. I sell buttons after my show often, and it's very funny. Like there's an inverse relationship between how loud the audience is and how many buttons I sell. Like sometimes it's like, well, that was quiet, I don't think they liked it, and then I'm like, wait, I sold out the buttons tonight. Like, I mean, it's also weird. You can't. I mean, it's great to take the lessons. It's great to think about it and learn and try and figure out, why did Calgary hate me and Winnipeg loved me. That's all great, but I mean, you can't look too hard under the hood.
No.
I think it's crazy making.
Sometimes you just have to accept that this show is not for this city, and
Yeah.
there's something about it. It's not their bag, and that's fine. You just have to accept that and move on. Because if you try to monkey with it and try to make it so that it'll work everywhere, it'll work nowhere.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm
Yeah.
curious about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, you dilute it, right? Like it's what make, like I think of people's, like the Merkin sisters, or like, any of
Yeah.
Ingrid's shows. It's like, it's so weird. You could leave me alone in a room for 800 years and I'd never come up with anything like
Yes.
that, right?
Yeah.
And I would like it to stay exactly as it is, please.
Oh yeah. No, the Merkin
Don't.
sisters is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, but it doesn't surprise me that it's something that Ingrid and that Ingrid was part of creating. Having seen Little Orange Man, which is like very much like was her signature show for so long, it makes sense that this show came from that brain.
Absolutely. And I feel the same about sort of, James and Jamesy and that gang. I had a laugh with Alistair because, their shows are like, I mean, controlled, beautiful chaos, right? And then my shows are like 12 angry puppets. And, it's like, there have to be 12. There are 12 monologues, neat and tidy. It's a murder mystery. And that happens, and then you solve it. Like, my shows are so organized compared to their, like, beautiful chaos.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the thing that I was going to ask, just sort of like as we draw to a close, I know that a lot of times you're making your puppets. You are
Yeah.
the constructor of your puppets. Um, how did you learn that? Was that like I'm finding stuff on YouTube? Was it trial and error? What was your process to becoming a puppet maker?
It sprung out of necessity, right? We talked a little about Baker's Dozen, 12 Angry Puppets, which was my first show. The concept for that was it was sort of a blank face puppet, and I had a briefcase full of noses and eyeballs and lips and things that I would use to make 12 characters, 12 neat and tidy monologues. And so that, I mean, that's hard to explain to anyone, right? It was just one of those cases where it's like, this makes sense in my mind, but I certainly don't think. I mean, first of all, at that point, I wouldn't have been able to afford anybody to make it. But second of all, I don't think I'd be able to accurately describe what I'm looking for because I don't quite know, right? So I just had to start learning. And so I kind of got it. We didn't talk about this, but I did Avenue Q in Toronto, and that's sort of like what really pushed me down the puppetry path. And so I kind of spent a lot of time with my hand up a puppet's butt and with a close view looking at how they were made. And then there's a wonderful, wonderful builder in Toronto called Andy Hayward. And he's the cleanest builder I know. And he built our second round of Avenue Q puppets for that production. And he was kind enough to give me a pattern. And that was the pattern that I took to make that first puppet. And then, yeah, and I kept going. I did a residency in Australia with a company called the Puppet Smithery to work on my sort of building skills. And sometimes I build for other people, for myself, for TV, for clients who just want puppets. And it's just become a little bit of a part of what I do.
Nice. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, to me, as somebody who grew up with the Muppets, both Sesame Street, the Muppet Show, and beyond, to me, puppets, Muppets, all of those creations are all basically magic. So it's always fascinating to hear about somebody who has figured out how to create that magical thing. So it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it makes me very happy. Like I like sort of bringing something into the world like that. And it's funny because I'm not a very good sketcher. So like I like to sketch, but it's just not my skill set. So like I draw these characters and they look kind of crappy, but then I can build them and make them into these beautiful looking puppets, and that makes me really happy.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Adam, thank you so much for talking with me this evening. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see your shows at the Fringe Festival.
Oh yeah, thanks. This was a lot of fun.
This has been an episode of Stageworthy. Stageworthy is produced, hosted, and edited by Phil Rickaby. That's me. If you enjoyed this podcast and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can leave a 5-star rating. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. Those reviews and ratings help new people find the show. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. And remember, if you want to leave a tip, you'll find a link to the virtual tip jar in the show notes or on the website. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the complete archive of all episodes at stageworthy.ca. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. See you next week for another episode of Stageworthy.